This is a trademark name question. For those of us who represent musicians, especially those who are of the independent type, who are organic, they very much want to fight to protect their names. And so what's happening, at least for the younger artists, they're doing the Fiona Apple thing where they'll take their first name and their middle names, many of which are, quite frankly, Americana and very, very normal, ordinary. So my question is, when you start with an artist and then 3 months later or 6 months later, you see on MySpace 2 or 3 artists, you know, a 14-year-old who's playing the guitar in her basement, and lo and behold, it's the same name as your client. Is there a way to somehow, through color or graphic, try in the first instance to differentiate the name so that if they become successful, you would better be able to merchandise that as a property?
Larry, go ahead.
It depends, and we run into this all the time because I do a lot of work with music groups. If it's a real common term, and it happens that many, many groups are out there, we're going through this actually right now with a group, where there are many, many groups out there with almost identical names. You can try to differentiate yourself in the marketplace by using logos and other indicia like that. The problem with that is that on the radio, the radio announcer doesn't say, well, that was so-and-so, and their logo looks like this. And so you run into the practical problem that consumers don't really know. If it's the identical name, you could have a problem. Keep in mind, if someone has a very, very limited use, that person still needs to prove likelihood of confusion. If their use is, you know, their grandmother and their father likes to listen to their music, you don't really have a problem. And some of these MySpace pages you go to, you'll see that there's, you know, 2 visitors or something like that. You have to be realistic about it. That doesn't mean they might not try to come after you, but document it. When you're doing the search, print out those pages showing that when you were adopting the mark, there was this very limited use. But the best thing to do is, like you were saying, do the searching early on so that it doesn't get too out of hand. The worst thing to do is to let a client develop a local reputation, let's say in Chicago, and they really get a nice following. Now when they go national, they've got to change their name because there's a group in Georgia with the same name. They're very upset because they lose all the goodwill. Sometimes adding something very minor can help differentiate the name from one another.
Thanks.
But you've also brought up something that's really important for people in entertainment to know, which is that I've encountered a lot, is that in the fields of entertainment, when you do trademark searching, the fields are often quite crowded, particularly music labels. Now that, you know, people can record and start a label in their garage, if you start with some internet searching initially by your client and then your trademark searching, it can be extremely difficult to find a name or a group name or whatever that you don't run into these problems. Kelly, how about you? Do you get involved with athletes' names if they're training for the Olympics?
No, we really, the times when I deal with athletes, it's usually with regard to endorsement deals and things like that. They have agents typically. If it's an athlete who is a big enough name that they're going out and doing those kinds of deals and wanting to do merchandising opportunities, they really do have that all covered by their own attorneys, and we don't get involved unless, of course, it gets to the point where if anybody was in the session where Mady Olivo was talking, there's a rule that prohibits the athletes from doing any kind of commercial activity during the Olympic Games, during that 17-day period, without the permission of their National Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Committee. But other than that, I would just also say, as Larry did, that there may be ways to make those distinctions graphically, as you suggested. There's special fonts that are always used, or with a logo design, but it becomes difficult in terms of if the oral recitation of it, especially on the radio, is identical, it's going to be harder to distinguish.
Phil, do you have any comment?
Yeah, you know, there are very few among us who can come up with a name like Mellencamp for a performer. I strongly recommend that when you get into situations like this, tell them you're the lawyer. You're not going to create a name for them. That frequently comes up in that context. There are people who do it, but you shouldn't take the lead, because then you're going to be responsible if there's a problem down the road.
That's good advice.